There's no choice in the current environment, so it's learn, learn or sink or swim.
Sink or swim.
And we are.
Do you have any idea?
Okay. Introductions, please. Go right ahead, John.
That says go. Okay. Well, hello, good evening, bonsoir. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties that you can't see me, but my name is John Hobday, and I'm a member of the English Language Cultural Program Committee of the Jewish Public Library. I'm very pleased to welcome you, wherever you are, to another in the JPL's innovative series of open books, presented under the auspices of the Rosalind Goodman Cultural Institute. Now, before introducing our author, I want to express my thanks, and I'm sure the thanks of each of you, to Roxana Bronze and Maria Resina for their creative and technical skills that have made this virtual literary salon possible. This evening, we're all going to have the pleasure of hearing from Taras Grescoe, a Montreal-based writer who has authored 7 books. These include the best-selling Bottom Feeder, which won the Mavis Gallant Prize for Nonfiction, Strap Hanger, a Globe and Mail Best Book in 2012, Sacré Blues, and The End of Elsewhere, as well as Shanghai Grand, which has received international critical praise. Taras Grescoe's books have won numerous prestigious awards, and his work has been published in countless publications such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Globe and Mail, the Guardian, and the Times. In a few moments, he will be reading from and commenting on his latest book, Possess the Air, which is about how people of conscience resisted the rise of fascism in 1920s Italy. Now, if the technology works as it's supposed to, I will now hand you over to Taras Grescoe. Taras, you're on.
Thank you, John, and I very much appreciate that graceful introduction. This is a new experience for me. This is a very strange time to be launching a book. The book came out in Canada in the fall, but it was launched in the United States on March 24th, and it dropped like a Led Zeppelin. One of the pleasures of writing a book and researching a book, and this one took me about 3 years to do, is at the end of it, you go out and follow the book's progress in the world. And that often involves going to festivals, going to bookstores, doing readings, and to meeting some of the people who might be interested in the subject, and having that valuable give and take. So I find myself in my office with 7 o'clock at night with my laptop on my beer fridge. I'm drinking water right now, but there's a beer waiting for me after this, and wondering who the heck is listening to this. I don't know. I can't see any faces, but I'm sure you're all wonderful people. This is an interesting time for this book to be coming out. This book was born out of my own love affair with the city of Rome, my own concern about what's going on with the rise of authoritarian leaders around the world. And we happen to be a very bizarre and parlous times in the history of the West or the industrialized world, where there are a lot of would-be authoritarians on the rise. And our neighbors to the south right now are undergoing riots after the killing of George Floyd. There's a president in the White House, Donald J. Trump, who is seemingly pulling out all of the classics from the authoritarian, if not fascist, playbook at this moment, including threatening to call in the army to crush the protests of his own citizens over the objections of state governors. So I find the book, which deals with the rise of fascism in Italy after the First World War, to have a lot of all too chilling resonances with what's going on right now. Now, with that said, this sounds like a a grim story, but for me, it's actually, it was a labor of love because I fell in love with the hero of the story, a fellow called Lauro de Bossis, who was a young Italian-American poet. His father was Italian. He was the leading translator of Shelley in Italy. And he'd fallen in love with a woman from New England called Lillian Vernon, and who was the daughter of a Protestant or a Methodist clergyman who set up the first Methodist church in Rome. So Lauro was a sort of a product of the Roman upper class who was initially sympathetic to the fascists, as a lot of people were. He was giving them the benefit of the doubt. But this book possessed the air as a story of how he became disillusioned and how he changed his mind and how he launched a daring symbolic gesture, which showed up the fascists, showed that Mussolini was basically a master of the bluff. I'm going to read a short passage now from the beginning of the book, which kind of sets the scene. It begins in contemporary Rome and then flashes back to the signal event at the heart of this book, which was Lauro de Bossis's daring flight in a tiny plane, a Messerschmitt, over Rome early in the 1930s. So this is from the prologue to the book, which is called The View from the Janiculum. A lucky walker in Rome, weary of dodging gelato eaters and rushing motorini, may be lured out of the teeming streets of Trastevere by the prospect of the upward sloping paving stones of the sycamore-shaded Via Garibaldi. To the right, a side street dead ends in flights of well-worn stone steps, bordered on one side by fortifications built by a 3rd century emperor to repel barbarous Germanic tribes. The staircase ascends alongside crumbling bricks overgrown with wildflowers and canary grass to a piazza dominated by a striking monument in luminous travertine limestone. The Fontana dell'Acqua Paola is a confection of the high Baroque, built around 5 niches, divided by columns of red granite and topped by high-perched griffins, lines of stone-cut Latin, and a gossamer iron cross, out of which water gushes into a cerulean basin as shallow as it is enticing. The pet project of a 17th century pope, it is fed by the same ancient aqueduct that once filled Trastevere's Naumachia, the artificial lake where the Emperor Trajan staged mock naval battles using galleys rowed by real slaves. Taxi drivers know it simply as the Fontanone, the big fountain. The Fontana dell'Acqua Paola, however, is merely the backdrop to a far more impressive spectacle. Crossing the paving stones of the semicircular piazza, the fortunate stroller approaches a curved stone balustrade, which projects like a proscenium over the most sumptuous of playhouses. Just beyond the high canopies of thin-trunked umbrella pines, the first metropolis of the world unscrolls to the limits of peripheral vision. Ecco, Roma. In the foreground, quadrilaterals of weathered stucco in hues of ochre and pink form a cubist jumble, jostling around the bend in the Tiber that snags Trastevere, the most ancient and authentic of Rome's rioni, or central neighborhoods, like a bishop's crozier. Across the river, the hemispheric roof of the 2 millennia old Pantheon, the largest dome in the world until well into the 20th century, protrudes from Rococo cupolas. That is very hard to say. Rococo cupolas, a concrete article cemented fast to the medieval and Renaissance city. And white as sun-bleached baleen, the Brescian marble of the Vittoriano, that pretentious monument to the earthiest of Italy's kings, rises against the impressionist smear of blue on the eastern horizon, the foreboding Sabine and Alban hills. The Latin satirist Martial, who owned a villa near the crest of this hill, the Janiculum, wrote of the vista, "From here you can see the 7 lordly hills and measure the whole of Rome." The only reminders that this is the second decade of the 21st century are the cell phone masts that bristle from certain strategic eminences and the occasional contrail of an airplane that scumbles the sky, notably unscraped by towers of glass and steel. It is a view that has consoled generations of visitors, suggesting that humans and their problems come and go, but Roma, the urbs aeterna, the caput mundi, the città eterna, will always abide. The city's persistence across the centuries seems to offer a salutary rebuke to an unhealthy obsession with the present. But Rome has never been exempt from history. From the balcony of the Janiculum, observers have watched the flames that leapt up from the temple of Jupiter as Sulla sacked the Forum, the cannonballs that burst in the Piazza Barberini after French gunners dislodged General Garibaldi from the Villa Aurelia, and the columns of smoke that rose from the rubble of the San Lorenzo district after it had been carpet bombed by flying fortresses in the darkest days of the Second World War. On a warm autumn evening in the 9th year of the fascist era, families that had wandered up to the Janiculum were witness to another dramatic episode in the city's history. As the sun set on October 3rd, 1931, a dot appeared in the western sky. In the gathering twilight, it quickly resolved itself into a fuselage that sprouted crimson-tipped wings. People stopped to watch its progress, for aircraft were no longer a common sight in Rome. The fascists liked to boast that not even a swallow dared to penetrate the sky over the capital without their permission. Whoever the pilot was, he was flying silently in a controlled downwards glide. Head swiveled as a plane passed above the treetops and crossed the Tiber on what seemed like a certain collision course with the palazzo where, as the day's newspapers had announced, Il Duce and the leading members of the fascist Grand Council had gathered to work late into the night. In the cockpit, a young man looked out over the rooftops of his hometown and wagged the wings of his little plane in triumph. Through a daring act of bravado, he was about to reveal what, for almost a decade, the dictatorship had been striving to conceal from the world. Mussolini didn't know what was about to hit him. So that's how this book begins. And that's the event that I try to sort of untangle in Possess the Air. Here's the cover of the book. I don't know if you've seen it. Published by Biblioasis in Windsor, Ontario. A wonderful independent publisher. The researching this story took me to Rome several times. I'd fallen in love with Rome when I was in my 20s. Went there for the first time, and I've stayed there many times since. Sometimes bringing kids with us, or Desmond, our oldest son, and I did research in the archives there, Archivio Centrale dello Stato, which is in a sector of Rome that was built by the fascists, planned by the fascists. The archives are in a building that was supposed to be one of the war ministries. It's a strange place to do research. Doing research there, I spent a couple of weeks going through the files. The fascists, like all totalitarians, kept extensive records on their citizens. There were many citizen spies in the fascist state. And that allowed me to untangle some of the story of what happened to this fascinating character. I tell the story through several key places in Rome. One of them is the American Academy in Rome, which is on top of the Janiculum Hill. And that was sort of the meeting place of Laura de Bossis, this young poet, but also people like Thornton Wilder, one of his great friends, the American writer, who came to Rome as a young man, escaping a domineering father. I tell the story through Sinclair Lewis, who the American writer who would end up writing It Can't Happen Here, a book I've been thinking about a lot lately because it's beginning to feel like it really can happen here these days. It was It Can't Happen Here, published in 1935, drew on Sinclair Lewis's experiences in Italy in the 1920s to construct a vision of a fascist takeover of the United States. in novel form. Very interesting book because he does it was written very quickly. It's probably not great literature, but it was a great portrait of the form, the folksy form that a totalitarian government might take in the United States. And it rings chillingly true almost a century later. There are other characters too. Two Canadians, Gilbert Banyani and his spunky wife from Toronto, whose name was Stuart Houston. And they met in Rome. He was Italian-Canadian, she was completely Canadian. They were archaeologists. He in particular was a renowned archaeologist, an expert in Roman antiquity, who would eventually go on to do important excavations in Egypt in the city of the abandoned city of Tebtunis. And I used this couple, this charming, witty couple, to tell the story of how Mussolini and the fascists tried to co-opt scholarship in the name of their ideology, and how people like the Bagnanis resisted subtly by insisting that the Roman Empire had never been Italian, which is what Mussolini was trying to put forth, but truly Roman. They were different entities. And I also tell the story of Rome and how Rome was transformed by the fascists, how it was made into an Augustan city. That was their ideal of what Rome should be. At the height of the Roman Empire, there were 1.4 million people living in Rome. By the 16th century, that number had dwindled to 26,000, if you can believe it. By the time the Romantics, the British and German Romantics had discovered it, the population was up to about 100,000, but it was very much an abandoned city. The forum that we see today was wandered by goats and cows, and the ruins had been turned into quarries to build the Baroque city, but it was very much an underpopulated city. And people like Mussolini, after the First World War, saw this as shameful. They saw Rome as being sort of the condescending stomping grounds of foreigners, and their dream was to turn it into a great capital again. And to a large extent, Mussolini succeeded. But it was interesting for me. One of my prime motivations, I'm really interested in city building and urbanism and how cities are formed and created. And one of my main motivations was to try to figure out how much of the Rome we see today is actually a fascist city. And the remarkable thing is, a lot of it is. I mean, the way approaching the Colosseum in the past, in the 19th century, used to have to go through tangles of medieval streets, similar to what you might see in the Marais in Paris right now. And all of a sudden, you come out of these medieval alleys, these old apartment buildings, and you'd have the Colosseum in front of you. What the fascists, what Mussolini did was to disembowel Rome. That was their actual term. They tore apart these wonderful, popular neighborhoods, stuck all the people on the outskirts of the city, in the borgate, they call them, the scraps of city, and built the roads that you see around the Colosseum and many of the ruins. They built a processional way, the Via dell'Impero, right through the Forum, all in the name of being able to allow processions of Fiat trucks and tanks to go through the center of the city. And of course, he presided over this from his balcony in the Piazza Venezia. By the height of Mussolini's rule, I think the population had exceeded 1 million. He had turned it into a capital again, but he also shut down all forms of dissent. He imposed brutal censorship on the city. And what's been interesting for me in this is seeing how the authoritarian style is being reflected in so many contemporary leaders. A question I got a lot is, did you notice any similarities between Mussolini and contemporary leaders? And I have to say, yes. It's always in the case of Trump, it's in the body language. I spent hours and hours watching newsreels of Mussolini and the fascists because the Luce Institute, which the fascists founded, the National Film Institute, has put all of its newsreels from the 20s and 30s online. So you can actually study what's going on, you can have access on almost day-by-day basis to what was going on in the fascist state. It's remarkable to see how Mussolini's body language is reflected in Trump's body language. That said, I have to say, Mussolini was probably a smarter man. And there were some intelligent people behind the fascist state, philosophers like Gentile, for example. Mussolini spoke French. He could get by in German. He had read Sorel, Kropotkin, and Marx. He was initially a socialist. So I credit him with a much more culture than the current president of the United States. However, in doing my research, you realize that there is just this sort of id among authoritarians and would-be authoritarians, and that's what Trump and so many of contemporary leaders share with this guy. It's the will to power. It's the desire to stifle dissent, and a certain canniness in carrying it out, and a certain instinctive ability to, the bully's instinct to outmaneuver his opponents. That's what we're seeing now. And that's what Laura de Bossis, the hero of my book, realized early on. After giving a lot of credit to the fascists, he came around and saw that how barbaric they essentially were. The origins of fascism in Italy are interesting. They come out of the First World War, and I don't mention the name of Donald J. Trump in this book. I was kind of weary of him while I was writing it. I'm still hoping he will be a passing phenomenon. But there's one point in the book, and I'll end this with an introductory passage that makes some of the connections between now and then, if you'll bear with me. The events described and possess the era begin in Italy 100 years ago, when war, corruption, and economic uncertainty had shaken the people's confidence in the fundamental institutions of democracy. At a crucial time, Benito Mussolini rose to power by promising to make Italy great again. Before declaring himself dictator, though, Mussolini was democratically elected to the Italian parliament. His success was enabled by elites, both conservatives and liberals, who chose to remain silent or to maintain their power by cutting deals with the man they knew advocated division, winked at brutality, and exalted war. Mussolini became Il Duce because too many Italians undervalued the free institutions underlying the modern democratic state, institutions that previous generations had battled to establish and defend, often at the cost of their lives. The willingness to trade liberty for a spurious promise of security, prosperity, and glory allowed an opportunistic autocrat to implement the tenets of fascism, an ideology that would visit unspeakable terror and bloodshed on Europe and the world. Not everybody accepted Mussolini's vision of the future. Many Italians were willing to sacrifice their careers, their freedom, and even their lives to oppose the hate, violence, and warmongering they saw taking over the public life of the country they loved. This is the story of how, in a period of rising authoritarianism, some patriots found a way to fight for the liberty that many of their fellow citizens had come to take for granted or even spurn. Which is what makes this, as the memory of the consequences of succumbing to the empty promises of a strong man appears to be fading, a story for our time. And I do think it is a story for our time. I think we need heroes at a time like this. And we need to see how people of conscience navigated parlous times, because we are living in parlous times right now. And to raise our voices against those who exalt violence, those who wink at division and racism and brutality is more important than ever. So that's why I wrote this little odd book, which sounds quite grim, but actually, I think is a bit of a page turner, just because the main character, Laura de Bossis, is such a wonderful, swashbuckling, idealistic, intellectual, beautiful young man. I've written I've written other biographies before, but this is one where I actually didn't get tired of the subject I was writing about. By the end, I was still in awe of him and still admired of him. Maybe it was made, maybe that's because his end was so mysterious. And this book is really an attempt to find out what happened to Laura de Bossis after his flight over Rome in 1931, which proved that the skies of Rome and fascist Italy were not invulnerable, that even a young hero in a small plane could overcome all of Mussolini's mighty forces. Anyways, thanks for the invitation tonight. It's been a pleasure, an oddly alienating pleasure, but it's nice to stare at my face on a screen and to talk to Roxana, Maria, and the charming John Obday. And I very much appreciate this opportunity.
Oh. Taras, thank you very, very much. A fascinating story. Beautifully read excerpts, by the way. And certainly disturbing parallels with the current bully in the White House. I'm sure that that all of us are watching all of that very closely and deeply concerned. Could you repeat the name of the publisher of Possess the Air? I just want to be sure that all of those who've participated in this book talks has the name of the publisher there, so they can have easy access to your acquiring your book.
Yeah, it's called Biblioasis, and it's available as an audiobook, as a germ-free Kindle or ebook, and at all of the fine independent bookstores in Montreal, including our local favorite, Drawn and Quarterly, but also Paragraph, and I'm sure at your wonderful library.
Well, look, I thank you very much. I know that my wife will seek out the audiobook version, and I'm sure if you're the reader, she will enjoy it immensely. Thank you very, very much, and you've certainly earned your beer.
Yes, I'm about to uncork it.